It was the spring of 2013. I was 32 at the time, living in a flat just outside of Bristol. I'd gone through a messy breakup 2 months before, and I wasn't handling it very well. The walls of the flat felt like they were closing in on me, especially on quiet nights when the rain hit the windows and I couldn't sleep. I started to drink too much, stay up too late, and avoid phone calls from friends and family. I told myself I needed space. What I really needed was to get out of the city. I used to go camping a lot when I was younger, wild camping, not the kind with campsites and electricity. My dad taught me how to set up a shelter, cook over a fire, and hike with a pack on my back. After university, I stopped going. Life got in the way, but something about those memories stuck with me. I started watching videos online of guys camping in the woods alone, under tarps, in the rain. It gave me some strange sense of calm. I decided I was going to do the same. I would spend 2 nights alone out in the Dorset woods. No phone.
No distractions.
Just me, the trees, and some cold, wet weather. I picked a stretch of forest near an abandoned quarry between Wareham and Wool. I'd seen a few hiking forums mention it, secluded, overgrown, not patrolled or watched. The perfect place to disappear for a bit without being disturbed. I took the train to Wareham early Friday morning and walked the rest of the way, cutting across old logging roads and stone-strewn paths. The sky was heavy with clouds the whole day. It had that thick gray look that tells you it's going to rain whether you want it to or not. But that was part of the draw for me. I wanted the weather to be miserable. I didn't want sunshine or singing birds. I wanted to feel uncomfortable, cold, and alone. I thought maybe it would burn some of the weight out of me. I brought a military surplus tarp, a lightweight sleeping bag, a jet boil for heating water, a folding saw, and a few other basics. I hadn't used any of it in years. It felt good to pack it all and tighten it down, like I was taking some control back. By the time I got to the woods, it was already starting to spit. Not a full rain, but that fine mist that turns everything damp before you even notice it. The trees were dense, mostly pine and twisted oaks, with the ground covered in dead needles and soft moss. I found a small rise tucked between 2 hills and set up the tarp in an A-frame between 2 trees. I cleared out the space underneath, laid down a ground sheet, and stacked some logs at the edge of the clearing to sit on. I boiled water for tea and sat watching the rain collect on the leaves. The first night was peaceful. It rained harder around midnight, steady drumming on the tarp, but I stayed dry. I didn't sleep much, though. Every little sound seemed to stretch out in the dark. A branch creaking, water dripping, something shifting in the undergrowth. I'd forgotten how alive the woods felt at night, even when nothing was moving. But I wasn't scared, not really, just alert. It was the kind of feeling that kept your senses sharp. The second day I spent exploring around the old quarry. There was a path half swallowed by weeds and thyme, winding up around the edge of the pit. The rock walls were steep and wet with moss, the bottom filled with stagnant water and rusted metal debris. I saw what looked like part of an old van submerged near the far end. Must have rolled in years ago. The whole place had an eerie silence to it, like sound didn't carry properly. Even when I threw a stone into the water, the splash didn't echo. I didn't hang around long. I followed a narrow track back into the woods, deeper this time, further from the road. I found another clearing with a few broken down tree stumps and bits of what looked like fencing poking out of the ground. I figured it used to be farmland. I thought about moving my shelter there, but decided against it. My original spot felt safer, less exposed. That night, the weather turned worse. Around 7 p.m., the sky dropped and the wind picked up. I got soaked hiking back. My trousers clung to my legs, and my boots squelched with every step. The clearing was dark when I got back. Too dark. I lit a headlamp and checked the shelter. Nothing seemed touched, but I had this weird feeling in my stomach, like something was off. I told myself I was just tired and cold, I changed into dry clothes under the tarp, wrapped up in my sleeping bag, and made some soup. The warmth helped, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I barely slept at all. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I heard something. It wasn't an animal, not a fox or badger or even deer. It was the unmistakable sound of something walking. 2 feet, not 4, and not light steps either. Slow, heavy footfalls in the wet leaves. At first, I thought maybe it was an echo. Maybe I'd moved in my sleep and it was just the forest shifting around me. But then I heard it again. Closer. I didn't move. I lay there completely still, barely breathing. The tarp flapped gently above me in the wind, and I could hear rain hitting the leaves outside. But beneath it all, those steps. Deliberate. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. Whoever it was, they were walking in a wide circle around my camp. I had no torch on, just the dim glow from the dying embers of my last cup of tea. I reached slowly into my pack and pulled out my knife. It wasn't much, just a short fixed blade I used for food and rope, but it made me feel less helpless. I stayed like that for over an hour, waiting, listening. The footsteps stopped eventually, or maybe I just stopped hearing them. I don't know. When morning came, everything was soaked and quiet. I stepped out of the tarp and looked around the clearing. There were boot prints, fresh ones. Not mine. They came from the south, circled the tarp once, and then vanished into the trees again. The ground was too wet to follow them far. I tried, but they disappeared into the brush after about 10 meters. I stayed frozen for a while, trying to decide what to do. My train back wasn't until the next morning. I could pack up and hike out, maybe try to find a B&B in Wareham, but part of me didn't want to admit that I was scared. I thought maybe I was overreacting. People hiked through these woods sometimes. Maybe it was a poacher or a local just wandering through, but they hadn't come close. They hadn't called out. They hadn't made a fire, just circled my shelter and left. I told myself I'd stay one more night, just one. I spent the day gathering dry wood, prepping a better fire pit, and reinforcing the tarp with extra lines. I wanted to stay busy, wanted to keep my hands working so my mind wouldn't spiral. I sharpened my knife, laid out everything in easy reach. When the sun went down, I was ready. I kept the fire small but hot, tucked under the edge of the tarp to keep the rain off it. I didn't eat much, just some dry bread and a bit of jerky. I had the knife on my lap and the headlamp looped around my wrist. I didn't plan to sleep. I sat there in the damp air, listening to the trees groan under the wind. It was sometime after midnight when I saw the light, a torch flickering through the trees. Not bright, just a faint bobbing glow. It was far away at first, maybe 50 meters or more. Then it moved closer, not fast but steady, like whoever held it wasn't in a hurry. I put out the fire, smothered it with a bit of dirt, and pressed myself back into the shadows beneath the tarp. My clothes were damp with sweat even though it was cold. The light kept coming, closer, then it stopped. I waited, knife clutched in my fist, breath shallow. The light didn't move for what felt like an hour. Then, just as slowly as it came, it started to fade away. It didn't turn and walk off. It just dimmed, like someone covered the torch with their hand, or turned it off completely. That was worse than seeing it, not knowing where it went. I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the dark, heart hammering, knife on my lap. I listened to the wind, the rain, the trees, and the long silences in between. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed everything as fast as I could.
No break fast. No tea.
I shoved the wet tarp into my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and bolted. I didn't take the old trail. I cut through the forest in a straight line toward the road, even though it meant climbing wet rocks and slogging through patches of bog. I slipped more than once, got soaked again, cut my palm on a bramble, but I didn't stop. Every time I paused, I felt eyes on me. I didn't hear footsteps, I didn't see lights, but I felt them, like something just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. When I finally hit the gravel track that led toward the village outskirts, I didn't stop walking until I was standing on the main road, soaked and shaking. I checked into a cheap inn that night and took the train back to Bristol the next morning. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't really know how to explain it. There was no ghost, no monster in the woods, just a person, a stranger, someone who walked in the rain, alone at night, without a sound. Someone who circled my camp and stood in the dark without ever making a move. But that's what made it worse. It wasn't a story. It wasn't a dream. It was real. It was human. And the thought that someone was out there, in those woods, watching campers like me without a word or a warning, it stuck with me. I haven't gone wild camping since. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits the windows in Bristol and I'm lying awake in bed, I think about that third night in the woods. I wonder what would have happened if I'd spoken up, or if I'd lit the fire bigger, or if I'd waited just a little longer before packing up and running. But I'll never go back to find out. I was 32 when I took a solo camping trip that I'll never forget, and not for good reasons. It was late October 2018, and I'd just come off a long and frustrating few months at work. I was living in Southern Oregon at the time, working for a small construction firm based out of Grants Pass. I'd been dealing with nonstop contracts, supply issues, and people not showing up on time. I'd had enough of the constant calls and texts. So when I saw I had a full weekend off, I didn't tell anyone. I packed my gear, filled up the tank of my old 2005 Ford Ranger, and headed out into the woods without a real plan. The place I ended up was somewhere north of Prospect. It wasn't a national park, more like one of those semi-maintained areas with no real ranger presence, just dusty roads and crude signs. I'd looked at a few satellite maps before leaving and found a narrow dirt road that looped into the forest and eventually dead-ended near a stream. That seemed good enough for me. I just wanted quiet. No people, no phones, no noise. Just trees, cold air, and space to think. I had enough gear for 3 nights. Tent, propane stove, water, a folding cot, sleeping bag, some freeze-dried meals, a solar battery, and a pistol I kept in my glove box. I'm not paranoid, but I don't like going into the woods without protection. I'd seen too many weird things over the years. Strung up animal remains, broken down cars miles from anything, strange campsites that looked like no one had left willingly. I drove for nearly 4 hours after leaving town, most of that on rough forest roads. By the time I found the place I'd seen on the map, it was already starting to get dark. The clearing was decent, about 20 yards across, flattened enough for a tent, and backed by a slope of trees that went up into the hills. To the east, maybe 50 feet away, there was a shed. An old one, rusted tin roof, faded red siding, padlock on the door. That should have been my first warning. Sheds like that don't end up that deep in the woods unless someone wants them hidden. But I didn't care. It was probably some logger storage unit or an old hunting shack. I figured it had been there for decades and no one used it anymore. I parked beside a tree and pitched my tent a good distance from the shed. The stream was just down a small path past some brush. I checked it out before setting up camp. It was cold, clear, and running fast over rocks, probably snowmelt from higher elevations. I filtered a bottle of water from it just to be safe and cooked a quick meal as the sky turned dark. That first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No wind, no bugs, no rustling, just the sound of the stream in the distance. I remember sitting in my folding chair and feeling strange. Not scared exactly, just watched. The woods had that stillness that didn't feel right, like everything was holding its breath. I brushed it off. I'd been alone in the woods before. Sometimes your brain starts playing tricks on you. I got in my tent around 10 and slept pretty well, only waking up once when I thought I heard something knock against my truck, probably a branch falling. The next day was colder. I walked upstream a bit after breakfast, following the current for maybe an hour. The land sloped up and got rockier the farther I went. No signs of anyone else, no campsites, no boot prints, no tire tracks. That's when I started to realize just how isolated I was. This wasn't a place people came to. There were no rappers or shotgun shells or fire rings, just wilderness. On my way back to camp, I stopped and looked at the shed again. From the front, it looked like a standard utility shed, maybe 10 by 10. The padlock was rusted but intact. There were scuff marks near the bottom of the door, like someone had tried to kick it or pry it open at some point. I walked around the back. There were no windows, just one high vent near the roofline and old handprints in the dirt on the siding. That made me uneasy, not terrified, but unsettled. Why were there handprints? Who'd touched it and when? I didn't dwell on it, but I didn't go near it again that day. I made lunch, collected firewood, and kept my ears open. I still felt watched. Every time I turned, I expected to see something or someone just ducking out of sight. That night, I woke up again around 2 a.m. I heard something moving, not close but steady. It sounded like someone dragging their foot in the dirt, pacing back and forth on gravel or leaves. I sat up, unzipped the tent quietly, and peeked out. Nothing, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the treeline. Nothing there. Then I aimed it at the shed. The sound stopped. I swear on everything I own. It stopped the second my light hit that shed. I waited a full minute, barely breathing. Then, slowly, I turned off the light and got back in the tent. I didn't sleep again that night, just listened. The next morning, the ground around the shed looked undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of animals. But there was something different. My truck door was open. I know I'd closed it. I never leave it open, not out here. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but the glove box was open too, and the pistol was sitting on the seat like someone had taken it out and left it there. I didn't pack up. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself maybe I'd left it open without thinking. Maybe I'd gotten lazy, that it wasn't what it looked like. I forced myself to stay another night. I kept the pistol in my sleeping bag with me. That third night, the noises came back. Footsteps, more deliberate this time. Closer. I stayed frozen inside the tent, listening. I heard something sniff the side of the nylon wall. Something breathing low and heavy. I didn't move, just waited, counting the seconds. Then it stopped. Silence again. At first light, I packed up everything in less than 15 minutes. I shoved things into bags without folding them. I didn't eat, didn't boil coffee, didn't even wash my face. I just wanted out. When I turned the key in the ignition, my truck didn't start. The battery was dead. It had been fine yesterday. The lights hadn't been left on. I popped the hood. The battery cables were cut. Not torn, cut with something sharp. I nearly lost it then. My heart was thudding so hard it hurt. I had no way to call for help. No signal. No sat phone. I didn't even bring a flare. So I started walking. I left most of my gear behind. Just took my backpack, water, and pistol. I figured if I followed the stream back, I could eventually find the old road and flag someone down. I walked all day. No one passed me. I didn't see any signs of life, just more forest. I wasn't even sure I was going the right direction anymore. When it started getting dark, I found a rocky outcrop and set up a crude camp. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want anything to know where I was. That night was the worst. I was curled up in my sleeping bag under a rock ledge when I heard it. Something was in the trees again, moving slow, then faster, like it was circling me. I kept the pistol close, but I couldn't see anything. Just before sunrise, it stopped. I slept a little then. maybe 20 minutes. That's all I could manage. I kept walking at dawn. I walked for 2 more days, rationing water, chewing dry granola. I had no idea where I was. I just knew I had to keep moving. I passed an old rusted truck one morning, crushed into a ravine. Looked like it had been there 30 years. I started to think I might never make it out. Then finally I saw a sign. Literally, a wooden Forest Service sign, half rotted, but with an arrow and a trail name. I followed it until I found a fire road, then a real gravel road. I flagged down a trucker after a few more hours and begged him to take me to town. He didn't ask many questions. I never reported it. I don't know who would have believed me anyway. No one was killed. I didn't see anything clearly, but I know someone was out there, watching, waiting, and they didn't want me leaving. 2 weeks later, I went back with a friend and a generator battery. We found my truck. All my gear was gone. The shed? Still locked. But there were new drag marks in the dirt leading from the back of it. Something had been moved. I sold the truck that month. Never went back to those woods again. I don't even like camping anymore. I'll do it in public campgrounds, sure, with people around, but never out in the deep woods again. Never where there's no one else for miles, and definitely never near a locked shed. It was the summer of 2018, early July, when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the wilderness of northern Minnesota. I was 32 then, working a stressful job in Minneapolis, and I needed to get away from the noise, the people, the endless calls and emails. I wanted silence, fresh air, and time alone. I had always been a fan of the outdoors, but this trip was more about escaping the daily grind than about adventure. I packed my old, reliable Jeep with a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, a small cooler, and the usual camping stuff: maps, compass, flashlight, extra batteries, first aid kit. I also packed my hunting rifle and extra ammo because, frankly, the northern woods could get dangerous. Not from monsters or ghosts, but from wildlife like bears and wolves. I wasn't scared, but I was cautious. I grew up in a rural area of Wisconsin, so I knew how to respect the wild. The drive north took about 6 hours. The highways gave way to smaller roads, then dirt roads, and finally a narrow path leading deep into the forest. I was heading to a spot near a small lake I had found on an old map from the library, off the beaten track where hardly anyone went. I wanted that kind of isolation. When I arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the pine trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. I parked the Jeep on a small clearing just off the trail and started unloading. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected because the ground was uneven and covered with pine needles. But after an hour, I had a small camp set up. A fire pit ringed with stones, a place to cook, and my tent pitched between 2 sturdy trees. That first night, the forest was alive with sounds. Owls hooted, insects chirped, and the wind whispered through the branches. I built a small fire and cooked some canned beans and a couple of hot dogs over it. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks into the darkening sky. The stars were bright, far away from city lights, and I lay back on a folding chair, staring up at the sky. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed, but the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, a rustling coming from the trees around my camp. I froze, listening hard. The wind was calm, so the sound wasn't just leaves blowing. It was deliberate, soft footsteps, maybe, or something dragging. I sat up slowly and grabbed my flashlight, turning it on and scanning the dark forest. Nothing but shadows. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or some other small animal looking for food. I always kept my food packed tight in the Jeep, but maybe something smelled it anyway. Still, I didn't like the idea of something circling my camp at night. The next day, I woke early and checked my campsite carefully. The ground around the fire pit had small tracks, maybe from a fox or a coyote. Nothing too alarming. I reminded myself that this was normal. I was in their home. The day passed with a mixture of hiking around the lake, fishing, and reading from an old paperback novel I brought along. The lake was beautiful and quiet, its surface glassy in the afternoon sun. The trees stood tall and thick, and the only sounds were birds and the occasional splash of a fish jumping. I didn't see anyone else all day, which was fine by me. As the afternoon faded into evening, I prepared dinner again. This time I had some fresh trout I caught from the lake. I gutted it and wrapped it in foil with some herbs I had brought, then cooked it slowly over the fire. The smell was comforting. That night I felt a little braver. The strange sounds hadn't returned, and the forest felt like it belonged to me alone. I fell asleep easily, lulled by the crackling fire and the peaceful dark. But on the third night, things changed again. I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. to a louder noise, much closer this time. It was a sharp snap, like a broken branch or a stick crushed underfoot. My heart jumped. I reached for my rifle beside the tent and turned on my flashlight. This time, the beam caught movement. About 20 yards from the camp, I saw a figure moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, not exactly. It was a person wearing dark clothes that blended into the shadows. The person moved slowly, deliberately, like they were trying to stay quiet. I froze. My mind raced. Who was out here at this hour? How did they find me? I didn't hear any cars, no other voices during the day. Was this someone lost? Or someone with bad intentions? I turned the flashlight off and stayed very still, hoping the figure would move away. Didn't. Instead, it stopped, just standing there in the darkness. For a long minute, I held my breath. Then, slowly, it started moving again. Not away from the camp, but circling it, keeping a distance but close enough to be seen. I didn't dare make a sound or a move. I just watched, gripping the rifle tightly. The figure vanished back into the woods after maybe 10 minutes. I waited another long while before I dared move. My hands were shaking as I checked the tent zipper and counted my gear to make sure nothing was missing. Sleep was out of the question after that. The next morning, I was too on edge to relax. I packed up my fishing gear quickly and decided to hike deeper into the woods, away from my original camp. Maybe I could find a new place, safer and less exposed. As I walked, I kept my eyes peeled. The forest seemed different, quieter, almost too quiet. The birds weren't singing much, and the usual rustle of small animals was missing. Then I found it. Near a shallow stream, I spotted fresh footprints. Large boots, muddied but distinct. They weren't mine and they didn't look old. Someone had been here recently. I followed the tracks carefully for about half a mile, leading me to a small clearing with an abandoned hunting cabin. It was old, worn down by years of weather, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The windows were mostly boarded up, but one was broken, and I could see inside. Inside, the cabin was empty except for some old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention was a pile of discarded clothing in the corner. Dark, rugged outdoor gear, similar to what the figure the night before wore. Something about the place made my skin crawl. I wanted to leave, but curiosity held me there a few minutes longer. I found a crumpled paper on the floor, a torn page from a newspaper, dated just a week before. It mentioned a man wanted for breaking into cabins and stealing gear around the area. That was the moment it hit me. Whoever I saw wasn't just some lost camper. They were a criminal, maybe dangerous, watching for campers like me. My heart pounded. I packed up and left the cabin quickly, moving back towards my Jeep. That afternoon, I decided to drive back to the highway and stay the night at a small motel. I wasn't safe in the woods alone anymore. Back in the motel, I called the local ranger station and told them what I saw. They thanked me and said they would send someone to check the cabin. For days after, I stayed in town, sleeping in a real bed and eating hot meals. I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I was safe from the forest shadows. 2 weeks later, I read a news update that the ranger team caught the man. He had been living off the grid, sneaking into camps and cabins, stealing supplies, and threatening hikers who got too close. The story said he was arrested without incident, but he'd been a real threat. The experience changed how I felt about camping alone. I still loved the outdoors, but now I knew real dangers lurked. Not monsters or ghosts, but real people with bad intentions. It was a hard lesson about trust, safety, and respect for the wilderness. When I finally went back to the forest months later, I never camped alone again. I made sure to tell someone where I was going, carried my phone fully charged, and stayed alert. The woods could be beautiful and peaceful, but they could also hide people you didn't want to meet. It was early September 2017 when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. I was 26 at the time, still working in construction, and I had a few days off between job sites. I wanted to be out where I didn't have to hear traffic, where I didn't have to look at another building going up or listen to another phone ringing. I just wanted quiet. I just wanted to sleep under the trees and wake up with the sound of birds and nothing else. No one around. That was the whole idea. I grew up in British Columbia, but by then I had moved out near Thunder Bay, Ontario for work. The forests out there are different, thicker, wilder in some ways, and they go on forever. I'd been hiking and fishing out there a bit on weekends, but I'd never gone too deep into the backcountry. That week I decided I would. A guy I worked with once told me about an old decommissioned radio tower somewhere northwest of Thunder Bay. He didn't say much about it, just said it was maybe 3 or 4 miles off a forestry road, past a trailhead that was barely marked anymore. He said the tower had been there since the 60s, used during the Cold War maybe, and was shut down in the late 90s. Not fenced off or anything. Still standing, just rusting in the trees. I thought it sounded interesting and, more importantly, remote. So I packed up my gear, drove about 2 hours north, and turned off onto a gravel forestry road. I passed 2 trucks in the first 10 minutes, both coming the other way. After that, I was alone. The road was narrow, bumpy, and lined with pine and birch that got thicker and darker the farther I drove. Eventually, I found what I thought must be the trailhead. There was no real sign, just a metal post with a faint red stripe across it and some barely noticeable tire tracks veering off through the brush. I parked my truck off the main gravel track, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking. It was just after 2 p.m. The first half-mile wasn't bad. There was a path not well used but walkable. Animal prints, some fallen branches, but no sign of recent people. I liked that. I passed a swampy patch on the left and climbed up a small rise that leveled out again with a mix of thick pine and scattered hardwoods. The trail started fading after that, but I kept my compass and GPS with me. I wasn't worried. Around 3:30 p.m., I found the tower. It stood about 70 feet tall, streaked with rust, the paint long gone. It was one of those lattice frame types, shaped like a narrow pyramid, with some kind of small metal equipment box at the base. There was no sign, no fence, just empty forest around it. The clearing it stood in was maybe the size of a hockey rink. Tall grass, broken branches, and weeds growing up through old cables. The tower's ladder was still bolted on, going all the way to the top, but I didn't plan to climb it. I set up camp maybe 50 feet from the base, close enough that I could see it from my tent, but far enough away that I didn't feel like I was camping under it. I cleared some space, got the fire pit ready with rocks, set up the tent, and laid out my sleeping bag. I even had a small fold-up chair. I made a simple dinner, beans and rice I'd packed ahead, and sat by the fire as the sun dipped low. It was peaceful, just what I'd wanted. But things started to feel a little strange as the sky went dark. It wasn't one thing, just little things. The forest felt still, too still.
No crickets, no rustling, no distant owls.
I didn't think much of it at first. I told myself maybe the temperature had dropped. That can shut up the wildlife sometimes. But then there was the tower. Something about it looked different as the light faded. Not physically different, it was still the same rusted frame, but it felt out of place. Like it was too sharp, too angular against the trees. It cast a long, thin shadow that seemed to reach right toward my tent. I shook it off. I was just tired. I'd hiked a long way with a heavy pack, and I wasn't used to this kind of stillness. Cities and towns have a background noise that you don't even notice until it's gone. That's what I told myself. I put out the fire around 10 p.m., zipped up the tent, and got into my sleeping bag. I lay there for a while, eyes closed, listening. Nothing, just that strange, heavy silence. Then I heard something. Not loud, not close, but real. It was a metallic sound, soft but clear, like a loose wire tapping against a pole in the wind. But there was no wind, not even a breeze. I opened my eyes. The sound stopped. I lay still, waiting. Then it came again. Faint tap. Then again, but a little louder. It was coming from the direction of the tower. I sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, listening hard. The tapping stopped again. I unzipped the tent partway and looked out. The night was dark, but the moon was up, and I could see the outline of the tower clearly. Nothing was moving. I looked for any trees swaying, any animals. Nothing. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There was something at the base of the tower. It was small, low to the ground. I couldn't tell what it was at first. I thought maybe a rock. Then I thought maybe a bag or an old box someone had left. But I'd walked past that spot earlier. There was nothing there. It wasn't moving. It just sat there. I watched for a long time. I don't know how long, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. My knees started to ache from crouching. I didn't see any movement. No light, no sound. Eventually, I closed the flap and lay back down. I didn't sleep much. I kept my small camp shovel beside me, just in case. I didn't hear the tapping again. When the morning light came through the tent, I unzipped it fast and looked outside. The thing at the base of the tower was gone. I got up, heart thudding, and walked over to the spot. There was a mark in the grass. Something had been there. I could see where it was flattened, like a small crate or stool had been set down. There were no footprints.
No drag marks.
Just that one impression. I looked at the equipment box at the base of the tower. It was closed, rusted shut. I didn't touch it. I decided to stay another night, but move my camp to the other side of the clearing. I told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. That night, the woods were still quiet, even more than the night before. I made a small fire, ate quickly, and went into the tent before dark fully settled. I left the flap unzipped just a little so I could see out toward the tower. Around midnight, I saw it again. The thing was back. Same spot. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't a box. It was a person, or something shaped like a person. It was crouched low, knees bent, elbows on its thighs, head tilted slightly up, staring right at the tower. It didn't move. It didn't shake or sway. It just sat there, watching. I stayed frozen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake whatever that was. I watched for nearly an hour. It didn't move once. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew it was dawn and the thing was gone again. This time, I didn't even pack up properly. I stuffed my sleeping bag in my pack, grabbed the essentials, and left the rest behind. I walked back fast, almost running, watching behind me the whole way. I didn't stop until I saw the roof of my truck through the trees. When I got in and started the engine, I didn't feel relief. I felt like something was still out there, watching. I drove straight home and didn't tell anyone. Not for a long time. It's been years now. I still think about it. I still don't know what I saw. Maybe someone lived out there, completely off-grid. Maybe it was just a hunter squatting near the tower. But why come back to the exact same spot 2 nights in a row? Why not move or speak or signal? Why sit there for hours without twitching? The weirdest part was that tower. I looked it up later. Couldn't find any records of it. Nothing about its frequency, its ownership, or why it was shut down. Like it had been wiped clean. I've never camped alone since. I go with people now, and I never pick random clearings near old man-made structures again. I stay on marked trails, in parks, where I can see other tents and hear other voices at night. Whatever that was in the woods near that rusted tower, whether man, animal, or something else, it wasn't just camping. And it wasn't sleeping either. It was waiting. I was 35 when it happened. It was in the summer of 2016, and I had taken some time off work to travel a bit. I worked in a mid-sized town in the north of England, mostly doing freelance landscape photography and some graphic design on the side. I'd been saving up to do a road trip across Europe, something quiet and away from the usual crowds, and that's exactly what I set out to do. I wanted silence. Not tourist silence, but real silence. The kind you only get deep in the woods, when there's no phone signal and the wind is the loudest thing around you. France was my second stop, after a couple nights in Belgium. I'd planned a few nights of solo camping in a fairly secluded area in the south-central part of France, near the edge of a large regional nature park called Parc Naturel Regional de Volcans d'Auvergne. Not many people went deep into the interior parts of that region, at least not at the time. It was just far enough from the bigger towns that you could go an entire day without seeing anyone. I had a reliable old green Citroën Berlingo that I'd converted slightly to carry a mattress in the back. But for this part of the trip, I wanted to sleep in a proper tent. Cooking on a small camp stove, gathering firewood, taking photos during the day and reading at night. I'd bought a new one-person tent from a decathlon in Lille before heading south. And after looking at satellite maps for a few hours the night before, I found what seemed like the perfect spot. An old trailhead near a faded dirt road that split off from a gravel logging path. No markings, no campsites, just empty woods and distant hills. I arrived there in the early afternoon on a Wednesday. It was quiet, like I'd hoped, with a soft breeze moving through the trees. There was no litter, no noise, no sign of anyone. I parked the car under some low-hanging branches and walked half an hour into the woods with my pack before finding a flat spot near a dry creek bed. I set up camp under some tall pines and a few younger beeches, just far enough from the trail that no one would spot me if they passed by. That first night was peaceful. I boiled some rice and vegetables on my little stove, ate on a folded bit of tarp while looking through my camera's photos, and then turned in early. The only sounds were distant owls and the wind shaking the trees every so often. The second day, I hiked around for hours, taking photos of the landscape and some half-collapsed stone walls that looked like they belonged to an old barn or maybe a shepherd's shelter. I came back to camp around 5 in the evening, sunburned and tired, and made myself a quick meal. I lay on my back in the tent that night, watching the tree canopy sway. It was quiet again. Too quiet, maybe. I fell asleep eventually but woke up just after 3 a.m. because I thought I'd heard something. It was like a short, distant crunch, the kind of sound you hear when a boot steps on dry twigs. I waited, listening hard, thinking maybe a deer had wandered nearby, but there was nothing after that. No more crunches, no brushing against branches, just wind. I unzipped the tent quietly and poked my head out. My small camping lantern gave off just enough glow to make the trees look taller and darker, but I didn't see anything unusual. I chalked it up to an animal and went back to sleep. But the next morning, when I walked down the dry creek bed, I noticed something weird. There were fresh shoe prints in the mud near a section where the creek had held some water from a rainstorm a few days earlier. The mud had hardened slightly, but these prints looked recent, still soft around the edges. Too soft to be mine because I hadn't been down that stretch the day before, and they were too big for me, maybe a size 11 or 12. The treads were different too, more like heavy work boots, while mine were trail runners with narrow grooves. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. I thought maybe someone had stumbled across the area by accident, maybe a hunter or hiker. It was rural France. People still worked in forests, collected mushrooms, or hunted game. But it still didn't make a lot of sense. There were no tire tracks near the trailhead, no noise, and no other sign of people. I told myself it didn't matter. People hike, people walk. Nothing wrong with that. That night, I couldn't relax the same way. I cooked, ate, then sat with my back to a tree for a while, watching the darkness around me. The wind had died down completely. I had no music, no podcasts, nothing. Just me and the occasional rustle of a small animal. I kept my lantern close. I slept lighter, waking up often. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I thought I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, more like a soft thump, like something being dropped. I stayed perfectly still, heart racing, listening. No more noises came. The following morning, I looked around the perimeter of the camp. Nothing disturbed, no tracks, but when I went over to the side where I'd stacked some extra firewood, I saw that 3 small logs were missing. I knew I hadn't used them yet. I'd stacked them neatly, end to end, like a short wall. But now there were only 2 left. Again, I tried to explain it away. Maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe I used them and forgot. But it didn't sit right. I felt that hollow sensation in my chest that comes when you know something's off but don't want to accept it. I decided I'd stay one more night and then move on. I'd done enough camping here, taken plenty of photos. Better to head east and get closer to Switzerland, maybe find another forest near the border. I packed my bag ahead of time and stowed some of my gear back in the car so that I could leave early in the morning. That last night was when it happened. I didn't bother making a fire. I cooked something quick and then zipped myself inside the tent before it was even dark. I left the lantern on low and kept a small folding knife nearby. Not that I thought it would help, but it gave me something to hold. I lay there for what felt like hours, eyes fixed on the ceiling of the tent, barely blinking. Around midnight, I heard movement. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, leaves crunching softly, then a pause, then another slow, careful step. I froze. The steps came closer. They weren't rushed or clumsy, they were measured, like someone deliberately trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. My breathing got shallow. I didn't move. My hands gripped the sides of my sleeping bag so tightly they started to go numb. The steps stopped maybe 5 or 6 meters away from the tent. Total silence again. Then I heard something even worse. Breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Shallow and slow. Just outside the tent. I didn't dare move. My lantern was still glowing faintly, and I knew the light must have been visible from outside. I shut my eyes and held my breath, hoping whoever it was would think I was asleep. Maybe they'd leave, but they didn't. Instead, I heard the sound of fingers brushing against the tent fabric. It was slow and light, moving from one side to another, then pausing, then brushing again. Almost like they were trying to feel the shape of my body through the material. I stayed frozen. Every second felt like it stretched into a full minute. Then, finally, the fingers stopped. No footsteps followed. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, still as I could be, for the rest of the night, knife in hand. Every creak of a tree made my stomach twist. At first light, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out, shaking. The forest was still. I looked around in every direction but saw no one. No sign of movement, no footprints, nothing obvious. But I knew what I'd heard. When I made it back to the car, I found something else that chilled me to the bone. On the back window of the Berlingo, right above the dusty glass, someone had drawn a simple X with their finger. It hadn't been there when I packed up the night before. I know that for a fact because I wiped that glass down after loading up. I threw the rest of my gear into the car and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I reached a proper campsite near Clermont-Ferrand, a commercial one with families, caravans, toilets, and light poles. I didn't sleep well that night either, but at least I wasn't alone. I never reported it to anyone. What would I even say? That someone might have crept through the forest to stand outside my tent and listen to me sleep? That someone drew a mark on my window? They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd ignore it. I still think about it, though, especially the breathing. It wasn't fast or panicked. It was controlled, intentional, like someone who had done it before. And the worst part? There were no threats.
No warnings.
No violence. Just that silence. That patience. That quiet presence in the night, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. I haven't camped alone since. I still travel, still take photos, but I stick to places with other people nearby. I sleep in hostels or hotels. The woods don't feel the same anymore. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear breathing that isn't mine. And every time I park my car somewhere quiet, I check the windows. I wipe them clean, just in case someone decides to leave another mark. I was 31 when I camped alone in a graveyard for the first and last time. It was late October 2017, just a few days before Halloween. I wasn't doing it for fun, or for some dare, or even out of boredom. It was just something I told myself I'd do. Something that kept coming back to me every time I was out in the woods or scrolling through old maps. I guess it started when I was younger and used to walk past this overgrown hill on the edge of our town. There was something about that slope, something about the stone wall with moss curling through the cracks, and the rusted iron gate hanging half off the hinges. The graveyard had no official name that I knew of. The oldest headstones dated back to the mid-1800s, most of them worn to near blankness. Some had fallen over completely. Others had little iron fences around them, rusted and half-buried in leaves. It was called Graveyard Ridge by most locals, if anyone talked about it at all, which they rarely did. It sat about 2 miles outside of Bremer Hollow, Tennessee, up a steep incline off a gravel county road that didn't show up on Google Maps. No signs, no maintenance. No one had been buried there in nearly 70 years, maybe more. I had an old topo map from the 60s that showed it plainly, right at the edge of what was once farmland, long since grown wild. The ridge overlooked a dense forest to the south and a dried creek bed that only carried water in the spring. That October, the weather had been unusually dry, and the leaves were already thick on the ground. That week, I had taken time off from my job at the automotive plant. I didn't tell anyone what I planned to do. I just packed my gear, loaded my old Toyota pickup, and drove out before sunset. I parked at the base of the hill, where the gravel shoulder widened out just enough for a single vehicle. It felt remote, though technically it wasn't. There were still a few farms out that way, and one old hunting cabin half a mile to the east. But on that ridge, with the wall around it and no living soul for 100 yards, it felt like the middle of nowhere. I hauled my pack up the slope slowly, trying not to slip on the dead leaves, and passed through the gate like I had done a few times before, always during the day, never like this. The graveyard wasn't huge, maybe 60 or 70 graves total. There were no big monuments, no fancy statues, just simple limestone and granite markers, many of them leaning at odd angles or overtaken by thick roots. I picked a flat area near the center, away from the edge of the ridge and out of the path of a large white oak that looked like it could come down if the wind picked up. I cleared a space of leaves and twigs, laid down a tarp, and set up my small one-man tent. I didn't bring a fire kit. No wood stove, no lanterns. Just a flashlight, a headlamp, a knife, some cold food, and a sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that buzzes in your ears after a while.
No bugs.
No wind, just the creak of the trees every so often, and the occasional sound of a leaf falling. I walked around a bit before dark, just to get a feel for the layout again. Some of the graves had names I could still read. Rebecca Ingram died 1892.
Charles Girout, 1911-1945.
One said simply Baby Girl, January 1923. Most had dates that ended before the Second World War. When the sun dropped, the air turned sharp. I pulled my coat tight and sat on a small folding stool, just outside the tent. There was no moon that night, or if there was, it hadn't risen yet. The darkness came quickly, and with it, the stillness deepened. I wasn't scared. Not then. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and I'd done it in weirder places. Abandoned barns, creek beds, even a collapsed fire lookout once up in West Virginia. But there was something different here. Something in the way the ground felt. It wasn't just that it was a graveyard. It was more about how the whole place seemed sunken in on itself, like the rest of the world had moved on and left this ridge to rot. Around 10, I got into the tent, zipped it up, and laid still in the sleeping bag. The nylon shell rustled when I shifted. Outside, I could still hear the occasional tick of bark falling or a distant owl. But somewhere around midnight, I woke up, wide-eyed, with that tightness in my chest you get when something feels off. I listened. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a deer walking through the brush. But I heard no hooves, no crunch of movement, just a kind of stop-start rhythm of faint sounds, like something moving in spurts and then going still. I waited. 10 minutes. 20. I unzipped the tent slowly and poked my head out. Cold air rushed in. I turned on my headlamp and swept the beam slowly across the rows of graves. Nothing. Just stillness. I listened again. Then I saw something. It wasn't movement. It was absence. A shape where there should have been leaves. About 30 feet away, behind a crooked stone with a chain link border, there was something dark. No taller than a person, but broad. Squatting maybe. I flicked the beam that way again. It was gone. My stomach tightened. I stepped out of the tent slowly, the light jittering slightly as I moved. I tried to convince myself it was just the light catching on an uneven grave marker. But I felt watched. Not just watched. Surrounded. Even though there was nothing in my sight line, I could feel pressure on the back of my neck like something was just behind me. I spun around too fast. Nothing. Just graves. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting outside the tent with the flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My breath fogged in front of me. My knuckles were white with tension. I didn't hear anything else, not really, but I never felt alone. When morning finally came, the light broke slowly over the ridge. It hit the trees first, then the graves. Dew covered everything. My pack was damp. I felt stiff. My muscles cramped from sitting hunched for hours. I packed fast, too fast. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just wanted to be off that hill. But before I left, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. About 15 feet from my tent, near a grave I hadn't paid much attention to, the leaves had been pushed aside. Not scattered, but brushed away in a clear arc, like someone had knelt there and swept them with their hand. Beneath it, the dirt was soft, damp, fresh-looking.
No footprints.
Just that curve in the ground like something had shifted underneath. I didn't touch it. I didn't try to find out more. I just walked away, down the hill past the gate to the truck. I didn't stop until I was back on the county road, gravel pinging under the tires. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not really. Not for a long time. A few weeks later, I went to the county records office in Fairview. I looked up the parcel map for that part of the ridge. Turns out the land was technically still owned by a church that had shut down in 1964. No maintenance records, no preservation efforts, just a note in the margin. Asterisk burial ground inactive. Plot maintenance ceased. Asterisk I tried asking an older man at the records counter if he knew anything about the graveyard. He said his uncle used to work the land nearby back in the 40s. Told me they used to bury stillborn babies and unclaimed folks up there.
No caskets. No ceremony.
Just holes dug by hand, sometimes not even marked properly. I never went back. The tent I used that night I gave away the next week. I couldn't bring myself to use it again. Every time I looked at it, I felt that cold knot in my chest, the one I had sitting in the middle of a graveyard under a black sky with something shifting just out of view. It wasn't ghosts. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe there are places where the past doesn't stay buried. And sometimes, when you camp alone on a forgotten ridge full of forgotten people, you don't leave with just your gear. You leave with something that never quite lets go. I was 16 when I last went camping with my grandfather, William Trenton. It was the summer of 1996, a dry one that year, up in the woods near Crescent Ridge in northern Idaho. The kind of summer where the ground cracked beneath your boots and the pine needles felt like straw. He was 72 at the time and getting slower, but still strong. The kind of man who wouldn't ever ask for help even if both his knees gave out. He'd always taken me out to those woods when I was younger. We'd fished the lakes, set traps for squirrels, cooked meat over open flame. But that summer felt different. He said he wanted one last real camp. No tents, no maps, no markers. Just 2 sleeping rolls, 2 knives, and an old .30-30 lever-action rifle he kept oiled like it was a family heirloom. We set out on a Thursday morning. I remember it being a Thursday because the gas station receipt in his glove box said so, from when we topped off the tank and bought jerky and matches. The plan was to hike deep into the woods past where the trail maps stopped showing anything useful, then make a camp near a stream he remembered from years back. The first day went like they always did. We parked his old Ford Bronco off a dirt service road, locked up the valuables under the seat, and headed northeast into the trees. I carried the bedrolls and extra food in a big canvas rucksack that burned my shoulders by midday. He carried the rifle, a hunting knife, and a heavy canteen slung across his chest. The trail, if you could call it that, vanished after about 2 hours of walking. We made camp that night in a grove near a small hill. The fire burned hot, dry twigs snapping like gunshots as we warmed our hands and grilled beef jerky between 2 hot rocks. I remember how quiet it got after sundown. So quiet that I could hear my own pulse sometimes. No wind, no birds, just that hard silence that sits on your chest like weight. That first night I barely slept. Not from fear, but from restlessness. The ground was hard and uneven, and I kept feeling small rocks and sticks through the canvas. I must have shifted around 30 times before dawn. My grandfather didn't move once. On the second day, we pressed deeper into the woods. Trees grew tighter together the further we went, some so close their trunks were fused with each other. Around noon, we came across a pile of rusted cans, boots, and broken fishing poles, all in the middle of nowhere. Looked like someone had left camp in a hurry. Everything was brittle with age. The labels on the cans were faded to white, and the leather on the boots had cracked like old paint. We didn't stop long. My grandfather only paused, looked at it for a few seconds, and kept walking. Around 3 p.m., we hit the stream he remembered. Still ran strong, even in the dry summer. Water was cold enough to hurt your teeth when you drank from it. We filled our canteens and decided to make that our second camp spot. We set up under a large pine tree that had split from lightning years ago, a hollow chunk running up its core. The wood inside was dark and smelled of burnt sap. We cooked canned beans and ate them with flatbread while sitting on mossy stones. I watched dragonflies hover over the stream and listened to the odd rustle of branches behind us. That night was colder, even though the air had been warm all day. I woke up around 2 a.m., freezing, despite the fire still flickering a few feet away. My grandfather was awake too, sitting on a flat rock just staring out into the woods. I didn't ask him what he was doing, because I knew he didn't just sit like that for no reason. The third day was when things started to get strange. Not supernatural, nothing like that, but the kind of strange that you can't explain with logic. We were planning to hike further up toward a ridgeline he'd always called Old Pine, a stretch of high ground covered in twisted, stunted trees. Supposedly there were elk trails and deep caves carved into the rock face from old mining days. The woods felt tighter that day, not just visually but emotionally. Hard to describe. The branches hung lower. The air smelled sour, like wet iron, and we started seeing marks. Tree trunks stripped of bark in narrow, vertical lines, not like claw marks, but like someone had scraped them with a knife, deliberate and uniform. Every few hundred feet, another one. After about 2 hours, we found the first sign of real trouble. A clearing, about 30 feet across, perfectly round, with no vegetation, just dry, cracked earth. In the center was a tree stump, burned black, with nails driven into the top in odd patterns. Dozens of them, all different sizes, some bent, some new. Around the stump were broken bits of metal, glass jars filled with yellow fluid, and a torn piece of blue tarp caught in the roots. We didn't camp there. We didn't even stop to eat. My grandfather turned back toward the stream without a word, and I followed him. His posture was different after that, tense, like he was listening to something just out of earshot. That night, I heard something move through our camp. Not a deer or a bear, something on 2 feet. Steady, deliberate steps. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, staring at the dim shape of my grandfather lying still as a stone beside the fire. The steps circled once, slow and calm, and then they were gone. I didn't sleep again until the sun was up. On the 4th day, he said we were heading back, but not the same way we came. The woods weren't safe, he said, though he didn't say it out loud. I just knew from the way he walked, faster, always checking over his shoulder. We skirted the burned stump clearing by half a mile, but still saw signs of it for hours. More bark-stripped trees, more glass jars tucked into branches. Once, we found a pile of bones laid out in a neat circle. Looked like they belonged to raccoons or rabbits, all stripped clean. By late afternoon, we realized we were lost. Not hopelessly, but far enough off course that neither of us recognized the terrain. My grandfather didn't say anything, just kept walking as if motion alone would straighten the map in his head. We came across an old trapper's cabin around dusk. It was small, sagging, made of blackened logs with no roof. Inside, we found animal skins nailed to the walls and a pile of bones in one corner. They looked fresh, not bloody but new, pale and sharp. The smell was something awful. I stepped outside and vomited near a root. We didn't sleep that night, just built a fire and sat back to back beside it. At one point, deep in the night, we heard a loud, wet snapping sound about 100 yards away, like something breaking branches in its mouth. Then silence, heavy silence. When dawn came, I noticed my grandfather had the rifle pointed downhill, aimed at nothing. His finger was resting gently on the trigger. He looked calm, almost like he'd been expecting whatever was out there. We pushed hard on the 5th day, uphill and westward, hoping to hit the dirt road again. My legs ached. I had blisters across both heels, and the skin on my shoulders was raw from the rucksack straps. Around midday, we crested a ridge and saw the old road below, winding like a snake through the pines. We made it to the truck by late evening. The Bronco was untouched, though there were odd smudges on the passenger side mirror, like fingerprints, too long to be normal. My grandfather wiped them off with his sleeve without saying a word. We never talked about that trip again. He passed away 3 years later, a stroke while fixing a fence on his land. At the funeral, I didn't bring it up to anyone. I kept the memory sealed tight in my head. But sometimes, I go back over it all in my mind. The stripped trees, the jars, the burned stump, the feeling that we were being watched from just behind the trees by someone who knew those woods better than we ever would. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't some tale of monsters or forest spirits. It was something worse, something real. A person or people out there living in a way that didn't belong to the rest of the world anymore. People who didn't want to be seen, who'd made the woods their territory with their own rules and warnings. I haven't been back to Crescent Ridge since. Never will. I still hike sometimes, but never without a map, never without backup, and never without telling someone exactly where I'll be. Because now I know there are places in the woods that don't want you there. And if you see the signs, the nails, the jars, the quiet, you turn around. You don't ask questions. You don't explore. You leave.